This morning, football teaches a lesson to every other aspect of public life, in England at least. Professionalism, discipline, calm, perspective, generosity, grace. And by football, I really mean Gareth Southgate. What a guy. Back in politics, there's big pandemic news, and as it recedes, there's a lot else to get back to. Following the heat bomb in America, the climate crisis. But here, a housing crisis. And social care, how we look after our old. Somebody, I can't for the life of me remember quite who, used to go around cheerfully chuntering about building back better. It's a great phrase. Now is the time to ask exactly what it means. So, our housing crisis, all those buildings around Britain which are still fire traps, all those people with bills they just can't pay. I'll be talking to the man in charge, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick. And as the Cabinet wrestles with whether taxes need to go up to pay for social care, I'm joined for the Labour view on the post-Brexit economy by Rachel Reeves in her new role as Shadow Chancellor. Lots of cheerful news in the papers this morning about an end to pandemic restrictions. Truth is, with infections shooting up and hospitalisations moving up as well, we are taking a big, calculated national risk. Stephen Powis, Medical Director of NHS England, will be joining me live. Reviewing the news and the football and the tennis and more, we have Alex Forsyth, who covers politics outside Westminster for the BBC, and Anushka Asthana of The Guardian. Should be an interesting morning. Let's kick off with the news headlines and Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you very much. Good morning. England's footballers are heading to their first semi-final at the European Championships for 25 years after a decisive 4-0 win over Ukraine in Rome last night. Gareth Southgate's side will now head home to Wembley to face Denmark in the last four on Wednesday. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks rounds up all the action from the Italian capital.
My head is telling me to calm down, but my heart is getting carried away, and long may that continue.
What's that feeling, England fans? Optimism or just pure, unbridled joy? Either way, it feels good to be in the semis of the Euros for the first time since '96.
It's fabulous. I suppose it's still sinking in a bit. You know, we're in another semi-final. It's 3 in 3 years. But uppermost in my mind again, we've obviously want to go the steps further.
We're looking confident out there, so hopefully we can continue that. The job ain't done yet, we've got a lot more football to play, but like I said, we're on the right track.
This was England's first match away from the comfort blanket of Wembley. Slab head for his heading ability, Maguire cemented England's lead. The pressure. England on their way! That was 2 goals inside 4 minutes, but the fans who'd come from all over Europe of the night. It wrapped up a victory that in truth was never in doubt.
We don't stop here, we've got another big game coming up and we want to go further this time than we did at the World Cup. So, no, of course, it's a great feeling to win here and the way that we've done it as well shows the big progress that we're making as a country. So, no, long may the improvement continue.
England-based fans couldn't come to Rome, but now football is coming home with 60,000 fans at Wembley on Wednesday. Natalie Perks, BBC News, Rome.
In other news this morning, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, says there is a compelling case that easing COVID restrictions will improve the country's health. Writing in the Mail on Sunday today, Mr Javid, who took over from Matt Hancock a week ago, said England remains on track for a relaxation of the rules on July the 19th. Retail bosses are calling on the government to take action against violence and abuse aimed at shop staff. This security footage was released by Boots Pharmacy to highlight the problems workers face. Some of the UK's biggest brands are campaigning for greater legal protection for employees. The government said that courts should be increasing sentences for such assaults. And there was an A-star performance from Britain's newest star at Wimbledon yesterday. 18-year-old Emma Raducanu, fresh from finishing her A-levels, has announced herself on the big stage by reaching the 4th round of the ladies' singles. Well done to her. That's it from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Very many thanks, and the front page is fairly predictable, I have to say, today. There's the Sunday Mirror, Lions roar in Rome, semi-gods they're calling. Exactly the same headline for the second week running, I think, that the Sun on Sunday has, semi-gods. The Sunday People are slightly different. We conquered, with Denmark coming, of course, next week. There'll be lots of people dusting down their Hamlet references, Prince of Denmark and all of that. The Observer, rather boldly, has not put football on the front, but Raducanu, that wonderful young tennis player, through to the 3rd round. And an interesting story we'll be following up with Rachel Reeves later on. Keir Starmer, it says, takes on the Tories with a buy British economic plan. It's a very different change of tone, a slight sort of British optimism there from the Labour Party. We'll talk about that. And then the Mail on Sunday has done the football and the tennis, but they really have the most important political story, I think, of the morning, which is Sajid Javid's piece, very, very strongly tilting towards the end of all restrictions on health grounds as well as economic grounds. We'll talk about that as well. The Sunday Times has an interesting story. We've been following this for a long time, a potential U-turn on the foreign aid cuts. Boris Johnson under a lot of pressure in the House of Commons, and Emma Raducanu as well on the front page of the Sunday Times. And then finally, the Sunday Telegraph there, Lions roar off to Wembley, and they are, as it were, quoting off the record Boris Johnson, saying that all the laws, including the need to wear masks, stopping you being able to go to a pub and stand at the bar and order a pint, all of those things are going to go because the NHS is now safe. So an awful lot to talk about. Can we start off, perhaps, Anushka, talking about the football? Because I know that you're an enthusiast and a fan, and most of the country, most of the audience watching this programme have got probably a slight throb in the temples this morning. Tell us about the coverage.
Yeah, definitely got a slight throb in the temples, and I am very much an enthusiast, but I'm certainly not here for my football expertise, but I will give it a go. I mean, didn't Gareth Southgate prove the naysayers wrong? There were definitely people earlier in this tournament sitting at home suggesting they could do a better job than him. I don't think anybody is saying that now. Yeah. As you can imagine, amazing coverage across the papers. I've got the Sun here, pages 2 and 3, with Kane tames cranes. Bring on the Danes, which is very good. I like the Mirror yesterday. Yes, we Kane. I have had a little look back through some of the older headlines this morning, you know, those saying Southgate was being too defensive and that he should drop Harry Kane. I think letting in no goals in the whole tournament and then winning last night 4-0 is a pretty good response to that. An amazing performance. It got a little wobbly at halftime. I do wonder what he said to the boys in the changing rooms. But there is a little quote in here I did want to read to you before we all get too excited and say we've won the tournament. Harry Maguire, who of course also scored a goal, suggesting we should calm down a little bit. He says it's a great feeling, back-to-back semis. I don't want to be a party pooper, but we do have another big game. He's very, very calm. I don't normally look at Twitter very much or read out tweets, but Madeleine Brettingham has a great one this morning. She says, Gareth Southgate is the ultimate middle-aged crush. I just want him to drive me to a colonoscopy appointment, then sit outside eating a Scotch egg in dignified silence, which is a brilliant tweet and sums up an awful lot. But we must not forget the tennis, must we? Oh my goodness, the tennis. I mean, that was so exciting. Emma Raducanu, just 18 years old. And I love this spread in the Mail on Sunday because it sort of sums it up. A-level Emma puts in a spotless performance and then says, I'm off to do the laundry because, bless her, she did not pack enough kits to go into the second week. Her parents thought she'd actually already packed too many, and you can't really blame them. The last time that a woman of her age in the UK got to this stage, it was Christine Truman, and it was over 6 decades ago. So what an absolutely amazing day for sport. Quite a moment. Thanks for the moment very much, Anushka. Alex, let's talk about this piece in the Mail on Sunday by Sajid Javid, because it's a very, very different sort of signal that he's sending to the outgoing, the ex-Secretary of State, Matt Hancock.
Quite right. I mean, he's written his piece for the Mail on Sunday where he says the economic arguments about opening up are pretty well known, but he's really making the case from a health perspective, saying there are compelling health reasons, referencing domestic violence, mental health, NHS waiting lists. This is, of course, because in the next few days we're expecting more from the government on its thinking about whether it will go ahead on July the 19th and lift restrictions. And this is particularly interesting for two reasons. The first, you say, is that shift really from Matt Hancock, the former health secretary, who was known for being quite hardline when it came to restrictions, making the health argument. And the second is that we've heard this argument that it's the economy versus health before when it's come to discussing lockdown restrictions. And Sajid Javid is shifting that and arguing the health case for it.
We thought when he came in that the balance of power, as it were, the balance of opinion in the cabinet was going to be moved more towards opening up as quickly as possible. And that certainly seems to be the case.
Yeah, his thinking on this is abundantly clear. And that will please Conservative backbenchers, of course, who've been pushing for this.
I think we can show, I mentioned one tweet. Here is Mark Harper of the COVID recovery group of, as it were, anti-lockdown Tory MPs tweeting this morning.
That's right. Very much welcoming the direction of travel.
Welcome, he says to Sajid Javid. You're joining our group. Yes.
This is it. But it is worth saying that we have had some alarm bells. So the British Medical Association only yesterday warning about the cases really going up, being alarming. And in Scotland in particular, that is being picked out as somewhere where there has been a real surge. So while the message from government seems to be we're pressing ahead with July the 19th, there isn't a sort of acceptance across the board that necessarily all the restrictions should be lifted. And it's worth noting government saying there are no final decisions yet on things like masks. And, we'll hear more on social distancing later this week because those decisions are yet to be taken. And, of course, this still remains a pretty difficult balancing act.
Just before I talk to Anushka about Keir Starmer and a change in Labour policy, let me ask you very briefly about Batley and Spen, because I know you were covering that. What do you think is the sort of political outcome that's most important for Labour holding that seat?
Well, by-elections can come and go, as we all know, and sometimes a lot can be put on them. But the key for this was about Keir Starmer's future. Had Keir Starmer not held that seat, then we would now be embroiled in discussions about Labour leadership and direction and whether he can retain that job. And what this has done and why this is so important is brought him some much-needed breathing space. It has quietened his critics, although it's worth saying I don't think it's silenced them altogether. And it's also worth noting that in Batley, because I spent a lot of time there were some very specific local factors in that campaign, very specific things at play,
and
which
Kim
might have contributed
won
to that result. Kim Leadbeater, I think by a lot of people accounts on the ground, ran a very strong campaign, which did play a part, I think, in her victory.
Anushka, a really interesting piece on the front page of The Observer, your sister paper today, about a change in policy, a buy British, make British Labour Party policy, the Union Jack slapped across their economic policy, which will surprise and perhaps worry some people in the Labour Party.
Well, as Alex said, it doesn't need much of a win. A short win will do it. It changes the narrative, and the narrative has been changed so Labour can come forward with policy. And we're getting this from Rachel Reeves, who you'll be speaking to today, which, as you say, it has echoes of some messaging of the past around Buy British. She essentially wants to change clauses within public sector contracts to make it easier for British firms to do well. I thought it was quite interesting that, while you're right, it's been briefed to all the papers and it's there on the front page of The Observer, the one place that she did an interview on it was the Sunday Telegraph, and the Sunday Telegraph then framed it as how different it was to when John McDonnell was Shadow Chancellor. Now, that's obviously a deliberate decision, that they do want to be reaching out to a different audience. An interview with the Sunday Telegraph is not trying to speak to the left of the Labour Party. But I think what she would argue, although we will hear when we hear it later, is that within this, there are things that would perhaps appeal to the left. So, for example, one of the ways she's talking about trying to do this is by setting higher environmental and labour standards so that, for example, Chinese companies can't undercut British companies. But as you say, with that comparison in the Telegraph, it is going to be something that could be a bit uncomfortable for some in the party. A
really interesting shift of direction. Alex, so many other stories to talk about. Can we talk about very briefly about cladding, because I've got Robert Jenrick on the show. And there's big campaigns in all the papers for quite a long time about this.
Yeah, and the story that the Telegraph go with is this idea that homeowners are going to be given more time to sue developers or builders if workmanship isn't up to scratch. This is part of the Building Safety Bill, which is going to be back in Parliament in coming days. And this is going to be a point of contention, as have so many aspects of the government's response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy.
4 years on now, isn't it?
Pressure from Labour, pressure from Conservative backbenchers about whether the government's doing enough to make sure that people live in these flats feel safe and have the work done, not at great personal expense. It's worth noting there's an awful lot of political pressure on this, but let's not forget the human cost too.
Alex, thanks very much indeed. And in terms of the human cost, Anushka, we talk about climate crisis on and off, but what's happened in Canada and the United States is really unprecedented this week, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a good spread here in The Observer about it, a devastating heat wave. I mean, they've picked out one place, Lytton in British Columbia, where normally they would have temperate climates, and it has hit 49.6 degrees. You know, you're reading about people putting up foil on their windows as they huddle inside. It's seen wildfires that are just devastating. One person is quoted as saying, "It feels like we've set the earth on fire." You know, we used to worry that it would be hard to get people to take the climate emergency seriously enough because you're trying to persuade them to deal with something that's going to affect the next generation or even the generation after. Well, that has just completely changed. This generation right now is having to deal with it. And in the run up to COP26, it's certainly going to sharpen minds as we come to try and find a solution to this, because as scientists have said, there are only 10 years within which to fix it.
It certainly has, and it's galvanised President Biden. We know that as well. Anushka, Alex, thanks both very much. Very interesting. And so to the weather, I haven't enjoyed it hugely. Grey, sticky, humid, clammy, turbid. Not quite an American-style heat dome, but it's been like living inside a moist, warm brioche. Not very nice. Over to Matt Taylor in the weather studio. Matt.
Thanks, Andrew. One way to describe it. It hasn't been the same everywhere, though. We had some sunshine as well, even today, to start the day across some western parts of Scotland. And some of you will stay that way all day long. But here's the weather perhaps you describe. Some big downpours already so far in Kent with that humid air. And you can see where the showers have been most frequent so far across the south of the country. One or two further north. But as we go through the day, the low cloud that we've got at the moment will thin and break. Lots more sunshine developing as well. And it's from North Wales, the Midlands, northwards, where we could see slow-moving thunderstorms dropping close to half a month's worth of rain in a short space of time. Risk of flooding, but they are showers. Some of you will avoid them altogether, staying dry, and a dry end to the day across the south, where it will feel a little bit fresher than it has done over the last few days. Now, as we go into this evening and overnight, some more in the way of rain at times, the odd rumble of thunder across northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. Drier tonight compared with last night across some southern counties of England. In fact, a drier day to come tomorrow. Temperatures not as high as they have been. Not as muggy to begin with as it has been either, and a bit more sunshine here, but rain continues. Parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, on and off through the day. Some of that will be heavy and thundery. More persistent rain in the north of Scotland later. More persistent rain towards the southwest. And this is one thing we'll have to keep an eye on, particularly through Monday night into Tuesday. Unseasonably deep air of low pressure, bringing yet more persistent rain and some strong winds for England and Wales too. Andrew.
Many thanks. Now then, the coronavirus epidemic is growing across the UK, while cases are rising. However, the number of people dying has remained very low. But the number of people being hospitalised is beginning to creep up again. There's now over 1,800 patients in hospital. And in 2 weeks' time, the government wants to end most and potentially all COVID restrictions. My first guest this morning is known within the NHS as England's top doctor. Stephen Powis's proper title is Medical Director for NHS England. Welcome. Now, we've got, as I say, infections going up quite fast. We can all see those graphs rising. And that would mean, I think, at this rate, around 80,000 infections a day by the time all restrictions are due to be lifted on the 19th. Do you think it's really wise to lift all restrictions then?
Well, let me take you back to January the 16th of this year when Sir Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England, was here on the show. Yeah. Now, on that day, we had around 33,000 people with COVID in hospitals in England. We were admitting one person with the virus every second. In January alone, over 100,000 people were admitted into our hospitals. Now, I'm really glad to say the situation is now very different. We now have around 1,600 patients in hospitals in England with COVID, around 240 being admitted per day across the country. And the reason that difference is so stark is, of course, because of the great success of the vaccination programme. So despite all the work NHS staff have had to do to manage patients with COVID, at the same time, we've rolled out the fastest and biggest vaccination programme in our history. Nearly 66 million vaccines have been delivered, 38 million first doses, 28 million second doses. So
I'm sorry, that all-important link between infections, hospitalisations and sadly deaths, that link, do you think that has now been broken?
Well, Public Health England, of course, are monitoring the data very carefully, and they are reporting that the vaccines give over 90% protection against severe disease, in other words, hospitalisation. So the link is not totally broken. There are people in hospital who've been vaccinated, but it's severely weakened. So, of course, the key aim now is to get as many people vaccinated before July the 19th. It's the NHS's 73rd birthday tomorrow. Yes. We'll be celebrating all the hard work people have done at St Paul's Cathedral. The best birthday present you can give to the NHS is to get that jab if you haven't had it already.
That's very interesting. We're going to go into this slightly strange new period where there's large amounts of infections being reported and passing around the community, but not large numbers of hospitalisations, and an end to masks and an end to all of those things. In that situation, are we going to have to take much more personal responsibility? In other words, some people will still be nervous and will be masked and socially distancing, and other people will be, as it were, flaunting enthusiastically their new freedoms.
Well, I think it's important to remember that there are some habits we've all developed during the pandemic that it would be really good to keep on after the pandemic. So washing hands more frequently. If you're feeling ill, don't go into work and spread infections. Each winter, of course, we get lots of respiratory chest infections, flu being perhaps the best example. And the more we can do around good hygiene and good infection control, the less we will see.
So all of that stays. What are the dangers of high levels of infections passing around in the community?
Well, of course, I think most people have recognised that COVID will become an endemic disease. In other words, it will become one of the many viruses that we see, particularly over the winter when the frequency is higher. We deal with flu every year. We will have to deal with COVID. And of course, key to that is the autumn vaccine booster programme, which may well have to continue in coming years as well.
Every year it's a new flu. Are we going to be in the situation where every year it's, as it were, a new COVID?
I think it's too early to say yet. Remember, this is a virus that until 18 months ago we hadn't seen before. It is adapting and developing and mutating for it to learn to live within the human population. So scientists will be keeping an eye. Vaccines will be developed for new mutations. Whether that's every year, we'll need to see.
But having it spreading fast in the community does mean, presumably, the risk of more mutations, one of which might start to escape the vaccine seriously.
Well, the more we can control the disease, the less it is spreading, the less that risk is, which of course is why the vaccination programme is so critical, because it does reduce transmission rates as well as reducing the possibility of severe infection.
The BMA wants to keep face masks after July the 19th. Is that wise?
Well, we'll see what the government announces. Public Health will, of course, be advising policy, and I don't want to speculate. But as you said earlier, I think some people will choose to be more cautious. Some people may choose to wear face masks in particular circumstances, crowded environments. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Those habits to reduce infections are a good thing to keep.
We've got two statements here which, in a sense, lead in different directions. The Health Secretary is saying there will be no going back, and that word irreversible is used again and again and again by ministers about restrictions. And yet we've got Chris Whitty and others saying there's going to be a very significant COVID surge this winter, then there's the likelihood of a big flu problem this winter. I'm thinking about the position of the NHS, looking forward to October, November, December, that kind of thing. Is it really wise to say there is no going back, there'll be no more restrictions?
Well, each winter the NHS prepares for increased rates of infection. We do that with flu every year. And of course, we're already preparing for a winter where we may well see flu coming back. We didn't have any last winter. And of course, we may see further rises in COVID. That is business that we're used to in the NHS. The autumn vaccine booster programme will be a key component of this. The higher we can keep levels of immunity in the population, the less pressure there will be in the NHS. So important to get that jab.
Would you expect people this autumn, this winter, to go in and have, as it were, one flu jab and one COVID jab at the same time?
That's what we are hoping to do. There are some scientific studies that need to conclude to show us that we can do that. JCVI, the independent body that recommends the government vaccine policy, gave interim guidance a few days ago. There'll be final guidance, I think, coming later in the summer. But I think administering both vaccines at once will be more efficient for us. It will allow us to get flu vaccine uptake as high as possible too. So that's what I'm hoping.
There's an interesting conversation going out about whether NHS staff should have compulsory vaccinations given their work. What's your view?
Well, my view has always been that it is a responsibility for staff who deal with vulnerable people, i.e. patients, should be vaccinated. That, for instance, is in the General Medical Council's Code of Practice for doctors. I think it's a professional responsibility. Obviously, the government is going to consult on whether it should be mandated, but my view is that staff should go ahead and get vaccinated.
But should it be mandatory? That's the question.
Well, I think I want to see what the consultation brings. I think it is already professionally mandated in the guidance that doctors and others have.
Let's talk about long COVID, because this is still quite mysterious, and there are various figures flying around. The React2 government survey suggests perhaps 2 million people in this country have long COVID. Can we start about asking, from your perspective, what are the symptoms of long COVID? What are you seeing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is this is a new condition, and we're learning about it all the time, and we will continue to learn. There's quite a wide range of symptoms, from tiredness to fatigue, to ongoing breathlessness, to headaches. It's quite a wide spectrum. And I think it will be important for us to learn whether it's a single condition or whether it's a range of conditions. We have set up 89 COVID clinics across the country to help manage demand. We think that might be about 350,000 people at the moment, but that's continuing to evolve. We put £100 million into the long COVID service with an additional 30 million to GPs to help with rehabilitation, which will be a key part of this. But we continue to learn. It's a new virus, remember.
Of course. Do children get long COVID, even if they haven't had, as it were, conventional COVID symptoms themselves?
Yeah, so some children can get symptoms that persist beyond the infection, and that's why we are, in addition to those 89 clinics, putting in a number of paediatrics, so children's hubs for long COVID across the country, so that there's a service for young people too.
Is the NHS prepared, if asked to vaccinate children?
Well, yes, the NHS is prepared to vaccinate children. Of course, that is a decision for government based on guidance from JCVI. And of course, we vaccinate children against flu each autumn, so it's something that we're well used to doing.
Why are you 25% more likely to die of COVID if you live in Greater Manchester?
Well, so I think the health inequalities that have been once again exposed through COVID is really, really important. Of course, health inequalities is so much more than just what the NHS can do. So housing, education all play into health inequalities. But there's no doubt the NHS can focus on this, such as we've been doing through the vaccination programme, working with local communities, local imams, vaccination centres in mosques. There are ways of getting healthcare to communities that have difficulty accessing them.
So you're talking now about different ways of working inside the NHS.
Yes.
Let me ask you about the 5.1 million people now on the waiting list, a record number of people on the waiting list, some of them with very severe conditions. What's the NHS plan to start to deal with that? Are you going to sort of prioritise different diseases, different conditions? Have you got plans to work in a different way to start to work your way through that backlog? Because it is an enormous backlog.
Yes, of course. And NHS staff have been working tirelessly over the last year to ensure that we keep all those services going. But they've inevitably been disrupted with 400,000 COVID patients. We are starting to make inroads into the backlog. We're ahead of where we thought we would be in April. We're looking at many new innovative ways, not only of working, but of technology. We're investing in robotic surgery, for instance, in Milton Keynes and Coventry. Clinicians, of course, will always prioritise those who require treatment most urgently, but we do want to get through that backlog as quickly as possible. Government has given us £1 billion this year already to help with that. That is being put to use already in the ways I've mentioned, and of course we will be discussing with government further what is required to get on top of the backlog.
I don't want this to come across as overly critical, but is there a danger that when it comes to cancer diagnosis in particular, the NHS has slightly dropped the ball during the COVID crisis?
Well, what we saw, unfortunately, during the pandemic was that people were reluctant to come forward with some symptoms of cancer. Fortunately, we are now seeing people coming forward, and referral rates are back. In fact, they're back to above what we saw before the pandemic. I've been talking about this really since last April, since the very early days of the pandemic, reminding people that the NHS is still open, it's still there for all conditions, and it is important that if you're worried, you come and seek advice, and we get you seen, and we check whether there's cancer or not.
Because there was an all-parliamentary report, you may remember, into this, published in May, and that said, and I quote, "It feels like the government and NHS leadership are not accepting that there's a crisis."
Well, I think we absolutely acknowledge that there is a backlog of work to be done. We absolutely acknowledge that we haven't seen people coming forward during the pandemic with symptoms such as cancer. We have really been encouraging people to do that, and so come forward if you need help.
You spoke earlier on in our conversation about the incredible pressures and hard work of NHS staff. Can I ask, do you think they deserve more than a 1% pay rise?
Well, I think there are many, many ways in which the work of our NHS staff, the hardest 1.5 years of the 73-year history of the NHS, can be recognised. Pay, of course, is one of those. You would expect me, as National Medical Director, to say, yes, I think we should
pay them more.
Pay them whatever we can. But, of course, that's a matter for government. There are independent pay reviews that are there to make recommendations to government. They'll be reporting soon, so we'll see what they say.
And this week, consultants threatened to go on strike, quite remarkably. What's your message to them?
Well, I have no doubt that consultants don't want to go on strike. Consultants, like all members of staff, whether it's porters or nurses or paramedics, have moved heaven and earth over the last 18 months to manage patients during the pandemic, and I'm sure they will want to continue working.
Now, you mentioned Sir Simon Stevens and the 73rd birthday of the NHS. Now, a year ago, he was sitting in that very chair and he said, and I'm going to quote, he hoped that next year, on the 73rd birthday of the NHS, we have, as a country, been able to decisively answer the question of how we're going to fund and provide high-quality social care for my parents' generation. Why haven't we solved it yet?
Well, that is still a question that we need the answer to. Now, clearly, the last year, other things have been happening. There's been a pandemic. But we in the NHS see the effects of the social care system every day. And, of course, we want our older people to live healthily and in dignity. So it is really a pressing issue.
Both major parties in office have failed to sort this over a long period of time. What is the effect on the NHS if we go through another 4 or 5 years with no answer to social care?
Well, obviously the NHS sees a lot of elderly patients who are relying on social care, and so the better care they receive in social care, the less pressure we see on the NHS, the better we are able to discharge medically fit individuals back into social care. So it does have an effect, but it's a broader issue than just the NHS, isn't it?
Politicians are scared of the rest of us. Do you think the truth is that we are going to have to pay higher taxes or hire something to fund social care?
Well, I'm going to leave those sorts of calculations to government, but as a doctor who has seen the effects, both the benefits and the downsides of the interaction between social care and the NHS for many years, the better that social care is, the better it is for the NHS.
Stephen Powis, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking to us today. Thanks so much. Now then, Joe Coburn has some news about Politics Live and what's coming up this week.
Join me on BBC Two tomorrow and during the rest of Wimbledon fortnight at the earlier time of 9:15 on Mondays, Tuesdays and Thursdays. We'll be at the usual time for PMQs on Wednesday. That's Politics Live on BBC Two tomorrow at 9:15.
After an angry and unpleasant campaign, the Labour Party retained the seat of Batley and Spen this week, and that protects Sir Keir Starmer from any immediate leadership challenges. But some are still questioning the direction Labour's travelling in and what it offers an electorate that's given the Conservative Party an 80-seat majority. The relatively new Shadow Chancellor is Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can I start by asking about some of the policies on the table this morning? Looking at infection rates and hospitalisation rates, are you completely comfortable that all restrictions will end without being reversed, without the possibility of being reversed on the 19th of July?
We want to see the scientific evidence behind any changes on the 19th. I want the economy and society to open up again. We're all getting sick and tired of the restrictions to our everyday lives and doing the things that we love. But it is important that if the QR codes are going to stop, if the masks are going to come off, that we are absolutely confident that that is the right thing to do. And at the moment, all we're hearing is briefings from ministers rather than the science behind it. We need to see that science, Andrew.
But it has to be a sort of calculated political gamble in the sense that nobody knows quite what's going to happen. Do you think we're going to get through the winter without any restrictions at all?
Obviously, that is what everybody wants. But look, of course, in the end, politicians are going to have to make decisions, but they've got to be based on the science. And what we've seen over the weekend is briefing by politicians on what they would like to happen rather than the data. And I've always said, and Keir has always said, it's got to be driven by the data. We've got to make decisions based on the evidence. And instead of briefing to newspapers, I would like the government to present the evidence on which it is making its really, really important decisions.
All right. Well, talking about big political decisions, you may have heard me talking to Stephen Powis about social care. The Cabinet is having a really intense discussion about whether or not we're going to have to pay higher taxes to fund a proper, decent social care system in this country. What's your view on taxes? Should we pay for social care?
I want to see a publicly funded, needs-based social care system. And as Stephen Powis said to you, the better state that social care is, the better for our National Health Service. And we are willing to have those difficult conversations about how we pay for those things. I've been in my job for 2 months. It is high up on my list of things that have got to be sorted and explained ahead of the next election. But the Prime Minister has been in his job for 2 years. And on the steps of Downing Street, when he became Prime Minister, he said that we have a plan for social care that is already prepared. Well, where is it, Andrew? Because it is letting down the people of this country. People in social care have been so badly treated by this government the last year and a half.
They've been treated badly, if I may say so.
They are owed something better than what this government are delivering today.
They've been treated badly by this government and by previous governments. Do you know when was the first promise of a properly funded social care system made in this country? Do you know that?
Well, I do know, Andrew, that when Andy Burnham was Health Secretary ahead of the 2010 election, he set up cross-party talks, which the Conservatives walked out of. That was a big mistake, and they have never restarted.
All right. Okay.
No, Andrew, they have never restarted in the 11 years since the Conservatives had took office. And that shows, I think, the neglect and the failure under this Conservative government, and we are paying the price today for that failure.
Rachel Reeves, you say this Conservative government, but the original problem goes back much further, even than Andy Burnham. 1997, a new Labour government, Tony Blair, tells the party conference that he doesn't want to live in a country where the only way pensioners can get long-term care is by selling their home. We then had many years of Labour government. We had 5 independent commissions into social care reform, and absolutely nothing happened.
And we were making progress.
It's a failure of Labour, and it's a failure of the Conservatives.
And in 2010, we were making progress on a cross-party basis, and the Tories walked out on it. Boris Johnson has now been Prime Minister for 2 years, and under his watch, we have seen deaths that didn't need to happen in social care because they did not put a protective ring around it. People came out of hospitals and into our care homes, and they paid with their lives, the most vulnerable people in society. The Prime Minister, if he's got a plan, we need to see it. It needs to be implemented because people are being let down. And we all know it from our own families. And it's got to change. We would, over the last 11 years, we would have entered into cross-party talks if the government had set them up. They have failed to do that. They've failed to offer a solution.
Under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party did have a policy for a national social care service. Are you brave enough to say that taxes may have to rise to protect our oldest citizens?
I said that at the beginning, my answer to your question.
Yes,
we are willing to look at how you fund it, because as Shadow Chancellor...
Willing to look at how you fund it is not quite saying yes, taxes may have to rise.
Yes, including looking at what taxes may need to pay for it, as Andy Burnham did when he was Health Secretary, which is why the Tories walked out of it. And I just want to be clear about this, because as Shadow Chancellor, and I hope in the future as Chancellor, I will make sure that any policies that I set out and that Labour set out will be fully costed, and we explain how they will be paid for. That is really important to me, because value for money and using taxpayers' money well really matters to me.
And you have huge decisions to take about fairness, not just in different social classes, but intergenerationally. Do you think the triple lock on pensions should now be scrapped?
The Conservatives, it was one of their key pledges at the last election.
I'm asking you.
And so, no, it must not be scrapped, because it was a pledge to the British people at the last election by this Conservative government, and you have to honour those commitments made in your manifesto. But today I'm setting out a much broader range of policies of how I would take forward our country post-pandemic as a Labour chancellor...
Okay, I'm going to come on to that in just a second, but on the triple lock, if you look at the numbers, keeping the triple lock means that an extra £4 billion a year are going on pensions and to many relatively well-off pensioners, while young people who are most affected by the pandemic and desperately need more money for education don't get that money. So you are siding with pensioners, as it were, against younger voters.
Well, you know, Andrew, that Labour have set out a post-pandemic children's recovery plan worth £15 billion, as set out by the government's former education advisor, Kevin Collins. He resigned because the government were not willing to put their money where their mouth is on funding our children's recovery. And this makes economic sense because you can't have an economic strategy without a strategy for our young people and skills and education. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that the costs of not investing in this catch-up are £450 billion. I think £15 billion on getting our children back up where they need to be, both academically, socially, etc., is incredibly important. And that is funding that the Labour Party would make.
Now, there's a very, very interesting policy that you've been briefing this morning about making public bodies of all kinds spend more on British-sourced goods, buying British, which in many cases will mean spending a bit more to protect the jobs and the businesses from whom they're buying, which is a perfectly reasonable policy from that point of view, but it does mean higher costs for consumers, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't actually, Andrew, have to mean that, because at the moment we're not taking into account the whole social value and social impact of different bids. So if you've got two bids on the table for public procurement, whether it's in HS2 or Trident submarines or offshore wind, one of them is creating jobs in this country, high-paid, high-skilled jobs that will result in people paying higher taxes into the exchequer. We give no extra weight to that bid compared to one that creates no jobs, no value in this country. If we're making these big sorts of strategic investments, as we are in offshore wind and HS2, it makes economic sense as well as common sense to ensure that we are creating good quality, good skilled jobs and apprenticeships here in this country. And at the moment, despite having the powers to do this, our government doesn't take into account these things at all. And that makes no sense. And I would change that as Chancellor.
Is this a Brexit dividend? Is this the Labour Party saying, do you know what, there are advantages to Brexit?
Look, some of these things we could have done inside the European Union. And under WTO rules, we could as well. France do it. France see this as strategically important to them, and so in their procurement they take into account the impact on jobs and businesses in France. So we could have done a lot of this stuff within the European Union, but outside the EU, Andrew, we have got no excuses. We set our own rules, we can do our things our own way, and we've got to use those newfound freedoms to support British industry and British jobs, and that's what I would do as Chancellor.
Some people in your party will be quite queasy about this. They will see it slapping a Union Jack on public procurement, and it goes back a little bit to Gordon Brown's short-lived British Jobs for British Workers initiative, and they won't quite like the tone.
I don't think it does do that, because this is actually about the essence of what Labour is for, because it is about ensuring that there are good quality jobs, paying a wage that you can bring a family up on in all parts of the country, and it's also about embedding into public procurement high labour standards, worker standards and environmental standards as well. That is what Labour is for, and that is what I would do as a Labour Chancellor.
Rachel Reeves, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Now a look at what's coming up on BBC One at 10:30.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live, from Paralympic hero to passionate politician, Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson tells Katie Piper about what drives her, her hopes for the future, and how an unusual saying from her granddad has inspired her success.
We meet the clergy turning to TikTok to spread the word to new followers, and we'll be discussing whether after COVID we can really justify the environmental cost of travel.
I'll be finding out how one author has been questioning our entrenched image of God. An entrepreneur, chef and musician, Levi Roots, will tell us why he's going to be giving the PM a grilling today. He'll be cooking up a treat for us later. Can't wait.
Join us at 10:30.
Very interesting. Now, in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, told the country, and I quote, "We cannot and will not ask people to live in unsafe homes." Earlier this year, the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, told the Commons that no leaseholder should have to pay for unaffordable costs of fixing safety defects they didn't cause and are no fault of their own. More than 4 years on from that tragic fire, Is the government fulfilling those solemn promises? The Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, is with me. Welcome, Mr. Jenrick.
Good morning.
Before we turn to that, can I ask you, given the level of infections now and likely to rise over the next few weeks, are you completely confident that all restrictions are going to end on July the 19th?
Well, we've been living now for 18 months with extraordinary restrictions of one kind or another. It does look as if, thanks to the success of the vaccine programme, that we now have the scope to roll back those restrictions and return to normality as far as possible. We should all be prepared, though, that cases may continue to rise. They may continue to rise significantly, but we do now have to move into a different period where we learn to live with the virus, we take precautions, and we as individuals take personal responsibility.
Do you see some kind of social tensions in all of this new period where some cautious people are wearing masks and other people are not wearing masks? Some are trying to socially distance, other people are refusing to socially distance. In other words, you're throwing a bit of tension into the community, aren't you?
I hope not. We trust the British public to exercise good judgment. People will come to different conclusions, as you say. There'll be things that we all need to do. We all need to ensure that we are double vaccinated, and that will be absolutely critical if we want to maintain this momentum. There are still people in those categories 1 to 9 who haven't come forward to be vaccinated. We will also need to ensure that people get the booster jabs when they come online, and also we'll need to ensure that people get flu jabs, because that will be a very important element in our plan in the autumn and the winter.
But so far as you're concerned, you expect all mask wearing, all restrictions to go on the 19th?
Well, I can't make that commitment this morning because the Prime Minister is going to make an announcement in the coming days. But it does.
Well, that's the announcement he's going to make.
It does look as if the data is in the right place. Cases are rising, as I say, and that should make us cautious, but it isn't translating into serious illness and death. And so it does feel as if we are now in the final furlong, in a period in which we can start to live with the virus and move on with our lives.
We've been talking about England. Scotland's being described in some of the papers as Europe's coronavirus hotspot at the moment. And do you expect Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland to follow suit around the 19th?
Well, I don't know. We would like the whole of the Union to move as one. We're going to work with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to try to be as coordinated as possible. Cases are slightly different in each of the 4 nations, but certainly in England, our view is that things are looking positive for July the 19th.
And do you think people will be able to travel to amber-list countries if they're double vaccinated without quarantine?
Well, again, we're still looking at the data, and an announcement will be made ahead of step 4 in that regard. But it is our objective, yes, that those who are double vaccinated should be able to travel to amber list countries as soon as possible, including for holidays.
Right, let's turn to 4 years after Grenfell. The government identified 469 buildings in England with that same dangerous cladding. How many of those have had it removed?
Well, 95% of those buildings have either had the cladding removed or there are workers on site now removing it. And about 70% of them have finished the job altogether. Completions are happening literally every week, and we expect that all bar a very small number of exceptional cases, that work to be finished by the end of the year.
So 95%, if I may say so, isn't really a meaningful figure, because that can simply mean somebody sticking up a sign or arriving on site. Now, the last figures that we've got...
If I could just make the point, I said that 70% of the buildings have been finished, and the rest will be finished barring very exceptional circumstances by the end of this year.
So you say 70%. We've got the latest figures from the Building Safety Programme. That's the monthly data release for the 31st of May, not long ago. And then only 260 out of the 469 had been completed. The work had started on 173 and had not started, nothing had happened on 33, which would suggest that 55% of the buildings with this aluminium composite cladding had not yet had it removed.
No, but work is happening very fast now. So it takes time to get workers on site, but once they are, work happens quite quickly. And so we expect the work to be finished by the end of this year. So every week you'll be seeing buildings completed, and I follow this data very closely, and so I could tell you the buildings that next week we expect to be completed.
It's been slow. This is 4 years on from Grenfell, and it has very direct human consequences. Let's just hear very briefly from one of the residents who was in Grenfell on that terrible night.
As long as that cladding remains on the outside of these buildings, Grenfell 2 will happen.
That was Edward Daffin, and he says, there is going to be another Grenfell as long as there is still cladding on those buildings, and there still is. For all the people watching this programme right now who are living in those kind of buildings, can you give an absolute guarantee that they will have somewhere safe to live by September?
Well, I know Edward well, and I've worked with him on a number of issues coming out of the Grenfell tragedy. And I have huge sympathy for those people living in buildings where they're genuinely very concerned for their safety. We're working hard. We've got a very strong team handling this now. And as I say, by the end of this year, we expect all but a very small number of buildings to have been completely remediated. Where they've not been remediated, it's usually for other reasons, like no one is living in the building. It's extremely difficult to remediate. Perhaps it's on a seafront, for example, or it's part of a broader programme of works. So on the ACM cladding, the most dangerous form of cladding, we are really making good progress now. There are other types of cladding as well on high-rise buildings, and there we've created a £5 billion fund to get that work done quickly as well.
You're painting a very positive picture here, but you also promised that all this so-called ACM cladding would have gone by the end of this year. Is that going to happen?
I expect all the ACM cladding will be off buildings by the end of this year, as I say, barring a very small number of buildings, and there are exceptional reasons for those.
So, barring a small number of buildings, so the answer is no, isn't it? It won't all be off. No, there will be buildings with ACM.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than you're portraying it, Andrew,
yes or no, really.
Because actually some of the buildings which have ACM cladding were only discovered in the last year or so. So the buildings which we've known for some time, yes, absolutely. There are some buildings we've discovered more recently. They'll take a little bit longer.
I'm just asking you about things you yourself have said. Let me talk about one particular building, because this is all about individual buildings, and progress does seem to a lot of people to have been very slow. This is North Point Tower in Bromley, which is one of the first to be approved for funding for recladding, and that was back in, I think, December 2019. And so far, not a single pound, not a bean, not a peseta, nothing has gone to that building. They've been offered money, they've gone through the process, no money has come. After so long, why?
Well, I know that building well, and I've worked with the residents there. There are some complications on that particular building, but again, that is within the programme. We are fully funding the remediation of the dangerous cladding on that building. The residents are working with us to work through some of the associated costs that are going to be incurred. But I expect that building will also have the remediation done by the end of this year.
Those residents have huge insurance premiums as a result of this, and they're having to pay day after day, week by week, for waking watch fire patrols all the time. Why should they have to pay for it?
They shouldn't. They shouldn't have to pay.
So who's going to pay? Are you going to pay them for it?
Well, the Exchequer, the taxpayer, is now paying more than £5 billion. That's a very large sum of money to try to help those leaseholders. But it should be the builders and the developers who should be paying for this. It is not right that either the leaseholder or the taxpayer has to step up. And I'm announcing today that we're going to change the law retrospectively to give every homeowner 15 years in which to take action against the people who built their building if there's shoddy workmanship. I wish we hadn't reached this point. I wish more developers had paid up.
Well, let me ask you about that. So people who are in buildings which are unsafe but are 20 years old get no help at all?
Well, this is a huge step forward. The law as we found it was that you only had 6 years as a homeowner to take action against the person who built your home. That often gives you less protection than if you bought a toaster or a fridge in the shop.
Lots of the most dangerous buildings are more than 15 years old.
Not many are, actually. Most of the cladded buildings that we're talking about here were built in the period from 2000 to 2017 when we had the Grenfell tragedy. So not all, I appreciate, but many, the lion's share of the buildings that are facing this particular issue will now be helped by this quite unusual change in the law.
So 2 questions. 1, why should those people not be treated fairly? But also 2, all this does is it allows groups of leaseholders, tenants, to get together and take a legal case against a very, very powerful, well-funded, well-lawyered development company. Now, that is not a level playing field. It can take years and years and years for these legal cases to come, and it's going to be very, very expensive for them. So it sounds much, much better than it is.
Well, I don't think there's any easy way out of this situation. You're absolutely right. I want the developers, the builders, the warranty companies, the insurers to pay up. I want shoddy workmanship to be paid for by the people who did it, not by the leaseholders. That is happening in some cases. About 50% of the cost of removing the Grenfell-style cladding has been paid for by the people who put it up. We're also seeing more of the larger developers coming forward. Since I made an announcement in February asking them to do so, they've committed £500 million to do that. That's your big volume house builders. This new change in the law, I think, does put new cards in the hands of the leaseholders so they can take action.
The trouble is that an awful lot of this is just for the cladding. All the other safety defects around fire, which have been uncovered in the course of the investigations, are not covered. I mentioned North Point Tower. Let me ask you about another building, which is Metis Tower, and that's in Sheffield. The Metis building, it's got 14 stories there and 113 flats. They were accepted into the fund, but only granted £6 million of the £12 million it's going to cost to make that tower safe. Now, that means that every leaseholder in that tower is facing an average bill of £50,000, which many of them simply can't pay. Is that fair?
Well, what we've done is focus taxpayers' money, £5 billion, with expert advice on the material that is most dangerous and the type of building that's highest risk. So high-rise buildings with cladding. I think that's the right thing to do. Well, that's what all the experts advise us on. I would just make a more general point, Andrew, if I may.
Which is, I want to stay on Metis for a second.
If I could just make this point, we do have to remember that most buildings in this country, including high-rise buildings, are fundamentally safe. And I don't want to see leaseholders being met with very high bills for works which may prove to be unnecessary. At the moment in the market, we're seeing what's been described by our expert advisor, Dame Judith Hackett, as extreme risk aversion. There is statistically a lower risk of fatality in a flat than in a house or a bungalow. So we've got to ensure that leaseholders are not being stung for bills for things that simply don't need to happen. And one of the big challenges for us as a government now is to instill proportionality into this debate.
Well, I mean, I've talked to people who've looked into this in great detail, who think that almost all of those higher buildings are still unsafe. And this is a national...
Well, that's, Andrew, that's not what our expert advisors say. Let me give you the statistics. Let me give you the statistics. Last year,
let me give you a
only
point.
3 people, mercifully, died in fires in high-rise buildings in this country. You have a much greater chance of dying in a flat, in a house or a bungalow than you do in an apartment. And so we've got to be careful that we instill proportionality, because at the end of the day, it's only the homeowner who will miss out, because they'll end up having to pay the sorts of bills you've just described.
Well, meanwhile, leaseholders, for absolutely no fault of their own, who've bought a property in good faith, are stung with bills they simply can't pay. I talked about the Metis building in Sheffield. Let's hear from one of the people who is living in that building right now.
To be at work, to receive that, and then to spend the entire rest of my afternoon just dwelling on that and thinking about, where am I going to get that money from now then? How am I going to fix that problem? What am I going to do about that? It's just miserable. This situation is absolutely miserable.
Now, what you said about people in that condition is that it's unacceptable for leaseholders to have to worry about the cost of fixing historic safety defects in buildings that they did not cause. That's what you said. So why does the Building Safety Bill, which comes into the House of Commons tomorrow, so dramatically water down your pledge?
It doesn't water down that pledge.
I can read you from your own notes. It does water down the pledge. The notes, the clauses 88 and 89.
Well, with respect to you, we haven't published the bill yet, Andrew, so you're reading an old version of the bill.
Your explanatory note, and it says
we haven't published the bill,
intention that as far as possible, leaseholders should not have to face unaffordable costs. That sounds gurgle.
Well, with respect, Andrew, we haven't published the bill yet, so you're reading from an old copy of a draft.
So that won't be in the new
bill. We have actually changed the clause that you're referring to, but you'll have to wait until we publish that in the House of Commons. What we've tried to do as a government is to protect leaseholders as far as we possibly can. We don't want either the leaseholder or the exchequer, the taxpayer, many of whom are not homeowners, to be paying very large sums of money for this. We want, in the first instance, the developer to be paying for this. We have put forward £5 billion, and so the gentleman you just referred to, and who I know and have met, and others, will not be having to pay for any of the costs of the unsafe cladding if they live in a high-rise building.
All right, Robert Jenrick, thanks very much for joining us today. That's all for me this morning. Thanks to my guests and, of course, to you for watching. I will be back here, as usual, at 9 o'clock next Sunday. Until then, goodbye.